Welcome to the Get Real Movies podcast. My name is Daniel Chadwick Shubat. I'm your host, and this is episode 10, where we'll be talking about the film The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare with the author of the book it's based upon, Damien Lewis. I'm very, very excited to talk to Damien today. It's a chat that I've really been looking forward to for a long time. There was a lot of up in the airness about the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. We didn't even get it released here in Canada until now, next week on Prime. And I'm just really, really excited to talk about this film because I really enjoyed it, and I think you will as well. So without further ado, Damien, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. I know it's been in the works for a while because the movie's been kind of will it, won't it, when it's coming out on Amazon Prime, but now we have a date, July 25th. So I'm really excited to talk about this. And for everyone here in Canada and the US, for people who didn't see it in its theatrical release, to finally see this film because it's one that I was quite looking forward to for a while. So I guess one of my first questions for you is, how did this book come about, and then later on how did this movie come about? Because obviously this came out in Churchill's secret files that were released long after the war was done for obvious reasons. And what really drew you to this, to write this novel? And then if you could maybe talk a little bit about how that translated into a movie in the end.
Yeah, so I was approached. The book was published in 2014, so long before that, I was approached by a guy who is a former Special Air Service veteran who basically said, there is this story from World War II that we really need to be told. And before all the veterans who were on these missions pass away, and it's opening with Operation Postmaster, but then it's all the missions that I write about in the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which really follows, in essence, Anders Lassen, who is the only member of the British SAS ever to win the Victoria Cross, which is our highest decoration for valour. So a standout legendary figure in the war. So it's Lassen, really, and his band of warriors from the early days of black operations through to the SAS and SBS being formed. So that's the story that he approached me about. And he was able to introduce me to several World War II veterans who's actually served in the unit, which is priceless. That's the golden arrow for any author, really, any World War II historian. Um, Sadly, by the time I'd written the book, all of them had passed away, bar one, and that one individual is a chap called Jack Mann, who served in the Special Operations Executive, which was nicknamed Churchill's Ministry for Ungentlemanly Warfare. He served in the SAS, the Special Boat Service as well, and in the Phantom Signaller Unit. So an extraordinary fellow, and he is still alive to this day. So we have one of them left alive. And to my knowledge, he's the only individual who is left. So it was distilling those testimonies, but then also the materials that one could garner, the very rich materials one could garner from all the declassified files. So, um, you know, files from World War II were generally closed under a 50-year rule or a 70-year rule. Some are closed under a 100-year rule. There are even files closed for 150 years. One in the mind boggles as what's inside them. But an awful lot of those files have, had, by the time I was researching the book, been opened, and that enabled one to tell, for example, the story of Operation Postmaster, which the movie's based upon, because that was an extraordinarily secretive, a high-stakes mission, which was, bound up in layer upon layer of secrecy during the war and long after the war.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I've met only a few World War II veterans, and when you meet veterans from World War II or Holocaust survivors or something like that, it really leaves a lasting impression and long lasting impression on you, because meeting someone who lived that, something that you've really only seen, my generation has only seen in the movies, and I've read quite a few of the books on it as well, as it's always been something that I've been interested in. But you don't really hear those stories from your grandparents very often because they either don't want to talk about it or were too young to remember. So when you met some of these people, what were some of the stories that stood out that might have been featured in the film, or some of the things that really struck a chord with you?
Well, an awful lot of these individuals have not talked about their wartime experiences for reasons which are easy in retrospect to understand. So, for example, we don't tend to talk about it that much, but an awful lot of those veterans, certainly those veterans from special forces units who served behind enemy lines and who knew that capture equaled torture and death, because it did under the Nazi regime. So for those individuals, many of whom, served, those who survived the war, served for 5 years behind enemy lines on repeated back-to-back operations, sometimes alone. Many of them were females, of course. So they there are worse things the SS and Gestapo can do to female captives than there are to men. I don't need to explain what those are. So these people survived on their wits, their guile, in the case of women, their beauty and their charm and their panache and their bravery. They were truly the bravest of the brave. And an awful lot of them carried the trauma of all those operations with them after the war. So they would be suffering from what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. It wasn't diagnosed at the time, or if it was diagnosed at the time, they called it psychoneurosis, and they treated is the wrong word. They so-called treated these individuals with electroshock therapy. It was shameful to be affected in this way, and most of these individuals buried their trauma under drink and aberrant behaviour after the war. So that's one of the reasons why so many of these people never spoke about it, because to speak about it would be to open themselves to the trauma once again and to make themselves vulnerable. The second reason why I think people didn't speak about it, and I can relate to this very closely being a former war reporter, it's very hard to talk about frontline and behind the lines experiences with people who haven't experienced them, because there is just no commonality, there's no common ground, you don't share the same language, the same experience. It's almost as if there's too much of a gulf to bridge. But when I sit down with former soldiers or serving soldiers of whatever generation, I can relate, and we can speak exactly the same language, because although I never served, I was on the front line and behind the lines a lot, not with a gun but with a camera, usually a film camera, is normally filming and reporting. And so the only difference really in those experiences was I wasn't able to shoot back. I wasn't there to fight. I was there to report. Otherwise, one is going through pretty much exactly the same experiences, including bonding very closely and very quickly with those brothers and sisters who are on your shoulder, serving with you either as in the media or mostly in various militaries. So, it was the same with the guys I spoke to about the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, several of whom became friends, and Jack Mann is to this day a very close friend of mine. Um, you know, those kind of individuals realize quickly when you are sharing the same language and experiences and emotions. And so, one was able to draw out of them very, very colourful and direct and rigorous memories and experiences. I mean, I've often had World War II veterans say to me, I've never spoken about anything or much of what I've told you, even with my wife, because I just know she wouldn't understand and I don't want to burden her with the trauma. So, I mean, I wouldn't wish upon anyone the decades of war reporting that I was engaged in. I certainly wouldn't wish my children to do it. But it brings kind of benefits, and that's one of the benefits it brings. It brings the ability to talk to these kind of individuals on that level, and also then to distill all of that into the pages and bring a certain realism and a certain immediacy to one's depictions of these kind of operations behind the lines. And there's no better book about behind the lines missions, in my view, certainly in terms of what I've written, than the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Anders Lassen, who was Danish, but volunteered obviously as a teenager for the British Armed Services. In fact, when he volunteered for the British Armed Services, he initially volunteered for the military, and the military said, we just can't deal with him. He's just too reckless and too wild to even consider, which is why he went into the Special Operations Executive, because that's the kind of people they were after. They were after mavericks and free thinkers and people who could think the unthinkable and do the unthinkable. So attack the enemies in ways that the enemy would never even conceive of, because it was unthinkable. I mean, Anders Lassen's greatest signature, really, apart from being such a highly decorated soldier from the Second World War and so loved and cherished by the men he commanded, was going into battle with a bow and arrow. In fact, I mean, he'd been brought up on his estate in Denmark. He was from a wealthy Danish family. Hunting, deer and fishing in the estate, didn't really go to school very much. And the bow and arrow, he was a master with the bow and arrow. And one of the first things he did to the consternation of the British War Office, was he petitioned them to use the bow and arrow as a weapon, as an official weapon of the British military in the Second World War. And they actually did do a study of it, and they came back to him and said, yes, we agree with you. It's silent. It's a perfect silent killer. You never run out of bullets because you can always go and make another set of arrows from stuff you cut from the forest. We accept all of that. However, we think it's too inhumane to make it a formal weapon of warfare in the British military. It didn't stop Anders Lassen from training with it and using it. In fact, where he trained in the UK before deploying on the mission, depicted in the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, where he trained in the UK, he trained in Dorset, which is, as you know, a very rural, leafy part of the country, and so they would be off on these, night-long exercises, dropped in the middle of nowhere, have to make their way back to the base by any means they could, and so you had a blonde, individual with a foreign accent who could sound German. He was Danish, but he could well sound German in the English he spoke, stalking the Dorset lanes with a bow and arrow. He got arrested dozens and dozens of times by the British Home Guard. And all the time his commanding officer was having the phone saying, look, it's Anders Lassen, he's with us, you bring him back. And he became known throughout Dorset as the Danish Robin Hood, because he went everywhere with a bow and arrow, and that was his trademark. So that's the kind of individuals you have, and Lassen's not alone. The book is populated by similarly maverick, brilliant, eccentric, spirited buccaneers that I actually really do believe that only the British military, well, the British Special Operations Executive, it was called the fourth arm of the armed service. It wasn't the army, wasn't the navy, wasn't the air force. It was the fourth, highly secretive, deniable arm of the British military, and it was only within such an institution that individuals like Lassen and his band of men could thrive.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating for me because especially in the last 10 years or so, where lots of files have been unclassified, we've learned so much more about the war, and it's given a whole new sort of view of the war. Even looking at someone like Churchill, where a lot of the British government wanted to make a deal with Hitler, and he didn't, uh, and then Operation Mincemeat, a movie recently came out about that. I remember reading that book when I was a younger kid, and it's really wonderful seeing those come out because it educates the new generation, which is sadly in many ways forgetting about the sacrifices that our forefathers made, and all the things they had to go through. But it also makes the war more interesting for people who might not have been interested in before, which sounds sad because it's such a grand tale of of misery, but also of triumph, and many other things. So I guess going more into the film a little bit, firstly, just want to ask quickly, how did this process come about? Did you get to chat with Guy Ritchie or any of the screenwriters at all about the movie, and what was that process like before we actually dive into the?
Yeah, so the movie came about from the very early stages. I mean, I think the book was actually optioned, which is a posh word for license, by Jerry Bruckheimer Films, and I think even before it was published, or shortly after it was published. And at the time, I had no idea that so Operation Postmaster is only the first fifth of the book. And the idea was from the get-go that they would make a series of movies, which is why at the end of the movie, of course, you have Churchill saying to the band of brothers, I own you now, you work for me, because then they can go off and do all the other missions in the book. But that was the intention from the get-go. And Jerry Bruckheimer and his producer, Chad Oman, both great guys, said to me from very early on, they said, look, we're going to make a movie which you are going to be happy with and proud with, and we guarantee you that. And if we're not going to do that, then we're not doing our job properly. And then it took 10 years to bring it to the screen, and it's really down to the dogged determination of those two individuals, Jerry Bruckheimer and Chad. Chad in particular. He's the producer of the Pirates of the Caribbean, so he's a long-lived, very successful Hollywood producer, and he just kept, calling me at all the different stages of different script writers being brought on board and different directors being brought on board and saying, "This movie's going to happen. It's going to be something you're going to be proud of, and I just need you to keep the faith and keep advising me." So I was advising all the way along with all the different script writers. I mean, I'd be in France on holiday with my father who lives in France, and bingo, there's a phone call from Chad Oman, from the States saying, hey, just tell me, what would Churchill have said at this juncture? And, how serious was the U-boat threat, and is it right to say that if they hadn't defeated the U-boats, Britain would have fallen, and kind of all these things. So all the way along the line, I was involved in that process, and then I guess the crazy thing was as they started shooting the movie. Of course, Guy Ritchie was directing. Henry Cavill, Alan Ritchson playing Anders Lassen, which is another great story I can tell you later when I first met Alan Ritchson. Gosh, but when they started shooting the movie, it was extraordinary because I'm an author, so I sit in my study. You can see it. I'm talking to you from that study, and and I write. And generally, we're very antisocial, and we don't like coming out of our study because we're busy writing. Anyway, I'd be sitting here writing, and I get up very early to write, like 5:30, and 6 o'clock, bingo, a text message was coming from Chad. It'd be like, "Oh, look, can you just help us rewrite this part of Churchill's speech because we're not quite sure we've got it right. We need it to be realistic or whatever it might be." And I'd say, "Yeah, okay, I'm kind of busy writing, but I can come out of the book I'm presently writing and come into. But give me a deadline. When do you need it by? Well, we start shooting at 9 o'clock. You've got 2 hours." And I'd be like, "You are kidding me? No, 2 hours." All right, that happened numerous times. I got used to it. Oh, it's Chad, right? 2 hours. Yeah, what do you need me to do? So, there were kind of these quite bizarre moments where I learned what it was like to be part of this process. I mean, another one, I was just mentioning it. I when I met Alan Ritchson, so the lovely publicist who worked for the movie producers, said, "Look, we need to get you on the set." And the best place to do that was on HMS Belfast, which is the Second World War ship moored in the Thames. It's now a museum piece run by the Imperial War Museum, and absolutely fantastic. She said, "We'll get you on to HMS Belfast. That's where they're filming all the naval scenes." And then the week I was supposed to go there, she called me up and she said, "Look, you're coming on Wednesday. This is the schedule. Blah blah blah." And I said, "Look, can I not come?" And she said, "What do you mean, could you not come?" I said, "Well, I'm busy writing and I don't like to." And she said, "You listen to me. You are coming." There was no gainsaying her. So I said, "All right, fair enough." So, and it was partly it was my own prejudice because I thought, my prejudice, my bad. I thought movie stars, they're going to be full of their own ego and self-importance. I'm not going to enjoy meeting them. You get my drift? Anyway, I went there, and the first person I met was Henry Cavill. What a gentleman. I was completely wrong. Shook my hand, "Mr. Lewis, Damien, it's an honour to meet you. It's an honour to make your book into a movie. I can't express how overjoyed I am to bringing this to the screen." And he meant it. He absolutely meant it. And then I met Alan Ritchson. Now I'm 5'6". Alan Ritchson's 6'4". He's about as wide as he is tall. So I was looking up at him going, and I know that Anders Lassen was whippet slim and certainly not over 6 foot. And he was a Dane who spoke English with a strong Danish accent. I was like, "Alan, what's it been like, playing a whippet slim kind of Danish guy who speaks with English with a strong Danish accent?" And he laughed and said, "Well, I speak English with a German accent, so that's the best I could do." And he said, "And I'm twice the guy's size, but I tell you one thing, I'm a demon with the bow and arrow." And I said, "Well, that's all that matters." And he was again a really, really special guy. And he said to me, and this is the serious point. He said to me, no prompting either. He said, "You know what?" And I won't do the American accent. I'm awful at accents. He said, "You know what? I'm so looking forward to the next movie, the sequel, because I really want to play that scene, the raid on Heraklion in Greece, where Anders Lassen, my character, goes onto the German airbase 3 times in the same night. They go in, they raid it, they retreat, they see some more airplanes, they go back in, they do the same 3 times. And each time he's shouting out orders in German to confuse the enemy and make them attack themselves, and that's how they get in and out again." So I'm so looking forward to playing that. Well, that was amazing because that meant he'd not only read the book, but he'd read the book carefully enough to know exactly what he wanted to do in the next movie. So yeah, and then I met all the rest of the cast, and they were all delightful, and I was wrong. My prejudices were blind. They were a superb bunch. And actually, the key thing that I garnered from being there on set was that somehow, and I don't know how they did it, but it was remarkable, and I hope it comes through in the movie. I think it does. They had somehow recreated that freewheeling, maverick, free thinking, think the unthinkable, no idea is too crazy spirit on the film set. So they were all there engaged and empowered, and it almost like reliving the same ethos, the same esprit de corps that the SOE had, on Operation Postmaster. And I saw that in action. And I thought, well, that's a remarkable thing to have achieved. And I think it bleeds through to the movie on the screen. I think you get the sense that they're a real team, and they're really empowered, and they're really enjoying what they're doing despite the dangers and all the rest of it. And so, in recreating that esprit de corps and the spirit and essence of the guys who served, I was mightily impressed.
It's interesting because I watched the TV show SAS Rogue Heroes a couple years back, or a couple months back, whenever it came out now, and it was quite fascinating because I had never found a war movie funny in that same way. Maybe Inglorious Basterds to an extent, but that was also a rewriting of history, as Tarantino loves to do. And this film showed that there were people in the army who were definitely not like, normal civilians or even normal army members. And I think that this movie showcases that, but obviously in a Guy Ritchie-esque sort of way, where, like you said, there is that surprise. There are moments where you burst out laughing, where you're like, why am I laughing? I feel a little bad that I'm laughing here. But it's probably how they saw it. And I was actually going to ask you a little bit about Anders Lassen, because in the movie he is quite a brutal, almost sociopathic character, and he takes joy in killing Germans. But I remember reading the book, and I won't go to the book too much because I know the audience might not have all read the book. But in the book, you talk about how when he killed his first German behind enemy lines, he really struggled with it, and there's something he wrote quite detailed about how he still thought about it. So once we get into Operation Postmaster and the history depicted in the film, is he more kind of turned off to that? Is that something that's is quite realistic in the film, or was he still quite sensitive to it as well?
So the film deploys Lassen, I think, as he would be to those around him, as he would appear to those around him. Bear in mind that what you read in the book about, so it's when Lassen knifes to death his first German sentry. And of course, during the war, he was forced to knife to death many of the enemy. I mean, it was one of his specialisms was stalking prey, stags, deer, literally at close quarters, and then killing them with a knife. I mean, how he did it, those who saw him do it just couldn't understand it. He had this supernatural ability to stalk and kill. But the first time he does it with a human being, with a German sentry, he's traumatized, but he doesn't tell that to people. He writes it in his diary. Remember, he confesses in his diary, and his diary intends to go to his mother if he's killed. So um, he was viewed by many of those he served with as borderline psychopathic. Um, I think you can have good psychopaths and bad psychopaths. There's actually a book written called The Good Psychopath. I think you can have, it's a spectrum. I think you can be a bad psychopath or a good psychopath and everything in between. And I think Lassen, certainly in the war, was a good psychopath because he's, cometh the hour, cometh the man. It's exactly what we needed. And the point about Lassen was, and it's front and central in the book. He combined that preternatural ability to hunt and kill the enemy with an extraordinary, almost unrivaled ability to bond with the local people within whose communities he served. So, for example, when they were raiding the Cretan islands, when they were raiding German air bases there, the Cretan people, they risked all, to feed, accommodate, hide, clothe, and go into action with Lassen and his raiders because he had that incredible ability to draw the locals on side. And because he was from Denmark, which had himself been invaded by and crushed under the Nazi jackboot, he felt it very personally what it was like to be the citizen of a nation under occupation. So he bonded very, very closely with those people. And there's that one, there's several scenes like it in the book, but one I'll just mention. They carry out a raid on an island, and Lassen writes a letter and gets it delivered to the local German commander. And the letter basically says, if you carry out any reprisals against the locals, I, Anders Lassen, will return with 1,000 troops and we will slaughter you all. Be warned. And it's not the first time he did that or the last. So he, as I say, he was a good psychopath. He combined that extraordinary ability to hunt and kill the enemy where necessary with this equally brilliant ability to bond with and protect and cherish the locals with whom he operated. So he was a complex character, a multifaceted character, but he was certainly on the side of the angels in the Second World War, in my view.
Well, yeah, he's someone that you want on your side, but if you're fighting against him, you would have the opposite view of a good psychopath. I want to go a little bit. There's so many scenes I want to talk about in the film, but I feel like we'd be here for hours if we did. So I guess one of the questions I was going to ask you is, what were some of the scenes in the film that you think they just it was historically perfect? And maybe that's not the right word, but it was very historically accurate and showcased what really happened. Because I know that's something people worry about a lot and think about a lot when it comes to these true story films. Is, well, did that actually happen? Did that happen the way they made it out to be? So I guess I'd love to talk about that. What were some of the scenes and things in the film that happened in real life as well?
Yeah, I think the depiction of Churchill and the stakes involved in the mission is fantastic. You've got to understand. I mean, I do not understand to this day how this mission got greenlit. Think of the stakes involved, right? So it's early in the war, Britain stands alone, and they come up with an idea to sail a Q ship, a disguised fishing trawler with hidden armaments halfway around the world to raid a neutral Spanish port in which there are, a clutch of German and Italian vessels. Now, why are the stakes so massive? Because Spain is a neutral country at the time, and that's violating all the rules of war if you get found out, which of course you will get found out if it's an overt mission. At which case Spain would be provoked into joining the war on the side of the Axis, on the side of Nazi Germany, which would have been disastrous. It would have changed the course of the war. It would have meant the Mediterranean was closed to British shipping, and it would have been a hellish outcome. And you know, Operation Postmaster was hated by it was abhorred by many on high command and many of the politicians in Britain, because they said you can't do it. The stakes are just too high. And anyway, even if the stakes weren't too high, and even if you pulled it off, it's not gentlemanly warfare. It's not the way British officers wage war. And those were the arguments. And Churchill somehow, God bless him, and I don't know how he did it, got the mission through. And even when they departed, they were still all that stuff about people trying to stop them. The senior commanders trying to torpedo the mission. That all actually happened. In fact, more of it happened than they were able to show on screen. So, Postmaster, the guys portrayed on the mission and the women, they weren't just fighting the enemy on a suicide mission where if they were captured, they knew they'd get denied by their own government. And because they were in civilian clothing, they'd be viewed as spies by the enemy, which meant you only faced torture and death. So they knew the stakes involved. But they weren't just fighting the enemy on this suicide mission, they were also fighting those in high command and those in Westminster, the political establishment, to actually stop them from scuppering the mission. So all of that's absolutely true. And the other thing that I think they've captured brilliantly, and I have to take my hat off to her because I think her performance is almost the steel shoulder of the whole movie, is Isa Gonzalez, who plays the special operations executive female agent. Now, the SOE side of the mission was absolutely crucial. It could not have happened without it. So what the SOE did on the ground in Fernando Po was they not only organised that party that you see in the movie, where they get the German and Italian commanders of the vessels onto the shore and they ply them with drink, and they team them up with pretty ladies to distract them from the mission, crucial to the operation. It would never have succeeded otherwise. But actually, in reality, SOE organised two such parties. The first party was a trial run to see if it would work, and the second party was the real thing. But also, some other things the SOE did on the ground. They got, and so they were all the SOE agents on the ground were there under diplomatic cover. So they were posing as members of the British diplomatic delegation to Fernando Po, but they were really SOE agents. So one of the things they did was they decided they had to get mail delivered from one British diplomatic establishment to another British diplomatic establishment, and they were on opposite sides of the harbour. So the quickest way to do so was to row across the harbour. This was all a construct, of course. And the chap rowing across the harbour, delivering the mail, because it was so hot and exhausting, had to pause halfway across. And the easiest way to pause was to grab hold of an anchor chain. And by grabbing hold of the anchor chain, he got his hands around it and managed to make a rough measurement of the anchor chain, which was how they worked out how much explosives was required to blow the anchor chains to steal the ships. And the other thing they did, which is even more brilliant, it's absolutely typical of SOE. Remember, SOE was set up by Churchill to do all the things you're not allowed to do by the rules of war. So that's sabotage, that's blackmail, it's corruption, it's money laundering, it's assassinations, it's raising guerrilla armies, all the things that are really not ungentlemanly at all. Sorry, not gentlemanly at all. So what they did in Fernando Po was just perfect. They worked out that the Spanish command senior diplomat in Fernando Po, the governor of Fernando Po, was an arch-fascist. Okay, so they thought we've got to nail him, or the mission won't work. So they found out he had a local lover, and they managed to photograph him with his local lover naked in the bath, and he was watering her with a watering can prior to doing whatever they intended to do. So they presented him with the photographs and said, we will make these public and present them to your family unless you agree to everything we say. And the first thing they asked him to do was to lend him his own personal aircraft so they could fly over the harbour and take reconnaissance photos of the ships, which they needed for the planning of the raid. And of course, he had to agree because he was compromised. That is the essence of what the SOE was about. And that's been captured brilliantly in the movie by Isaac Gonzalez and the other characters who play the SOE agents on the ground. Just they've nailed that absolutely. So there are scenes, of course, which didn't happen during Postmaster. I'll give you an example. The raid on the island to rescue Appleyard, who they need for the mission. Okay, that raid did not happen during Postmaster, but that's not the point. The point is, shortly after Postmaster, in real life, they carried out a series of raids on the Channel Islands, which were almost a carbon copy of the raid as shown in the film. So the point is, the script writers took one of those raids, transported it back into the Postmaster timescale because they needed that kind of scene early on. So where they step away from the veracity of the true story, they've done so in a way which is truthful to the real drama that then unfolded. So I'm kind of okay with it.
They're just playing with the timeline a bit, but they're still
Yeah,
capturing the essence of the
yeah,
truth, really. One scene I was going to ask you about, because you mentioned them fighting not only the Nazis but also against the British High Command, who didn't want this mission to happen. One scene in the film is when they're on their way to Fernando Po and they're stopped by a British naval war vessel. Was that something that did happen?
yeah. There was an encounter with a British naval vessel. There were very, very serious. I mean, it's not all in. I can tell you one of the things that happened in terms of trying to stop them. They couldn't fit it into the movie. Okay, so what happens is, in reality, they get to Nigeria, which is the stopping off point before doing the raid on Fernando Po, having sailed halfway around the world and not getting blown out of the water by various Nazi and fascist vessels they encounter on the way. And they're supposed to pick up a local force to bolster their numbers. The local military commander in Nigeria refuses to provide any forces to assist them, although, of course, he's been ordered to do so by high command in the UK. So he said, no, I don't agree with this mission. It shouldn't be happening. I'm not doing it. So, and again, brilliant improvisation. They go instead to the governor of Lagos, a British diplomat, and he says, no problem. I'll ask for volunteers from the diplomatic service. So actually, those individuals who join the raiders, and it's like a dozen or 2 dozen of them, they are all volunteers for the diplomatic service. So they might have served in the First World War, but they're there as engineers or surveyors or teachers or whatever it might be. And they step forward. They have 48 hours training on the high seas, how to canoe the boats and all the rest of it, and how to use a Tommy gun, and off they go. Some of them are in their 50s, and this is just brilliant. That's absolutely true. It's absolutely what happened. This was a hodgepodge force of a coalition of the willing. That's the extent to which those in high command went to try to torpedo the mission, and they did so out of two things: fear, if it went wrong, and fear of the diplomatic fallout, which would have changed the course of the war, and fear that this was not the way the British military should wage war. It was ungentlemanly conduct in the extreme.
Wow. It's just such an unbelievable story that when you read it and when you watch it, it does remind you very much of those unbelievable spy stories from the 60s and 70s, and you think of Bond, and then you realize Ian Fleming was there. He was living this. That's one of the big questions I wanted to ask you, was about Ian Fleming and his role, and him just showing up. It felt a little bit for me like one of those superhero movies where all the great characters just keep showing up out of nowhere.
Yeah, sure.
And one of them was Ian Fleming. So
Yeah,
I guess what was his role, and how did that, do you think that informed his future writing Bond novels and things like that in a big way?
Yeah, I mean, I know the cast seems implausible, but it's true. Ian Fleming at the Admiralty was the taskmaster for Maid Honor Force for these individuals, and in fact, again, something they couldn't fit into the movie. Bear in mind, Fleming had come to them with several previous missions, extraordinary, equally crazy undertakings, and at every moment, Fleming had come to them and said, "Would you undertake this mission?" They said, "Absolutely." And then it was their detractors from on high who'd got every single mission prior to this one torpedoed. They've been blocked and blocked and blocked and blocked until they get Postmaster through. And then going to your question about, how much did Fleming, base Bond upon these kind of missions? Well, Fleming basically wrote the Bond series of novels, which are real missions. They are real missions from World War II undertaken by SOE, which he's translated or transcribed, whatever you want to call it, into a post-war environment with different villains, but they are actually missions that happened. Fleming couldn't write about them as true stories because you weren't allowed to because of the secrecy laws, obviously. So he just turned them into fiction. And in terms of Bond, who is Bond? Well, Bond is a photo fit of 3 or 4 characters that he worked with throughout the war. One of them is Gus March Phillips. That's one of the key characters. The guy who commanded the Operation Postmaster mission is one of the key characters that everyone says Bond is based upon. Another is a chap called
Hmm.
Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale, who was the Paris senior officer of the Secret Intelligence Service, another individual that Fleming worked closely with throughout the war. So he took the characters and the real mission, made that kind of photo fit of 3 or 4 characters into Bond, and then took the missions that most captured his imagination and turned them into fiction. That's the Bond series.
And a question I have, not fully related to the film, but related to the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, is something I read was that Christopher Lee was the famous actor who played Saruman and Count Dooku and many other, and Dracula and many other famous characters in history. His history is, I think, should be made into a film one day. But I heard that he was also part of this Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Is that the case?
Yeah, so Lee was an SOE agent. It's very hard
Wow.
to find out what Lee actually did, and I've tried. The problem is, okay, SOE, the Special Operations Executive, the Ministry for Ungentlemanly Warfare, was deeply, deeply, deeply unpopular. It was deeply unpopular for several reasons. One, because it was doing things which were grossly ungentlemanly, and most people in the British establishment didn't approve of it. Second reason it was unpopular was because, on many levels, they were extremely successful, and so they proved the naysayers, the people who resented them, wrong. And the more you prove your naysayers wrong, the more you resent you. So at the end of the war, lo and behold, SOE was disbanded. It lasted a few months, and they got rid of it. Just put it out to grass. Churchill was voted out of power. SOE was disbanded, and the sad thing was, the really tragic thing was, that during it being disbanded, 85% of SOE files were burned.
Oh,
So we only have left 15% of the history of that unit. That's what remains. And of course, because of the blanket secrecy laws, very, very, very few SOE agents ever wrote their wartime stories. So that's what we're up against. We're up against, a void of lost history. I mean, how many Operation Postmasters were there? How many other missions like Operation Postmaster took place and they're lost to the burning of those files? We don't know. We know Postmaster exists because the file survived fortuitously. But you've got to bear in mind there's probably 9 other missions of equally crazy daring do, which we just will never see the light of day. They're lost to history.
yeah, it is incredibly sad, and the more I learn about each war book that I read about another operation that just seems to beggar beyond belief, it makes me wonder how many of them there were. So that is really fascinating that they burnt all of that, and it just seems like such a bastardization of what happened, really, because they should be honoring that, not just forgetting about it. But I guess they didn't have the foresight to see that we might be interested in learning about that history and things like that. And like you said, when people are wrong and they're proven wrong, they usually either are able to admit they're wrong, or they dig in even deeper. I think something we see a lot in the world today. One of the final questions I was going to ask you about the film is there's so many rich characters in this film, and you mentioned that hopefully they'll be explored more in sequels and things like that. Gus March Phillips, him and Aiza Gonzalez's character don't really interact in the movie, but then we find out afterwards that Aiza Gonzalez's character, who she was based on, her and Gus March Phillips ended up getting together after the war. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, what was the history behind that, and why do you know why they might not have gone into that in the movie as much? Was there not enough time? That's something that I was quite interested in after watching the film.
Yeah, so Gus March Phillips and the character that Isa Gonzalez plays, who was an SOE agent, they knew each other before the mission. She was a very beautiful British actress before the war. SOE recruited lots of actors and actresses into its ranks for obvious reasons. You know, if you can act, you know, on the stage, perhaps you can act in front of the SS and Gestapo when they arrest you behind enemy lines and accuse you of being one of, you know, an enemy agent. So lots and lots of actors were brought into SOE. And so Gus and her knew each other prior to Operation Postmaster. And then after Gus March Phillips returns to the UK and does a couple more missions, he and she then get married. In fact, they conceive a child, and then March Phillips goes away on his last mission and is killed, sadly, in the war. And so, you know, their daughter is orphaned. You know, great tragedy. Um, why they didn't go into that in the movie? Maybe they're saving it for a sequel. Maybe they're saving that love interest for a sequel. I don't know. Maybe they felt there wasn't space and time. It's a very dense movie in terms of the action and the moving parts and the characters. So maybe they just felt that they didn't have the time. But you know, Isa Gonzalez is such a powerful character in the movie, and so alluring. You know, so genuinely alluring. I'm not just talking the fact that she's a physically beautiful woman. I'm talking the fact she's got such spirit and such gusto and such daring and bravery and courage. Actually, a really fascinating story about Isa, which I think you'll appreciate. So, of course, I met her on HMS Belfast during the filming, but didn't really have, you know, that much to do with her. She was very busy on the set. But then I met her at the after party for the launch in America in New York, and I brought with me a coin, a commemorative coin, like a medal, from the Special Operations Executive, the club that was set up in London during the Second World War, now the Special Forces Club. And on one side is printed the SOE logo plus the motto, the spirit of resistance, and on the other side, the club. Okay. And so I met Isa at the after party and I gave her the coin and said, look, you know, just to say thank you from Special Forces community in the UK for, you know, for portraying a female SOE agent with such gusto and reality and verve. You really knocked it out of the park. So this is, you know, from the club that was founded in World War II to, you know, for individuals like you. And it just wanted to say thank you. And I had a coin for most of the cast members. And she said, she's really touched. And she said, you know something? She said, I read everything I could get my hands on about female SOE agents during World War II because they were so unbelievably brave. So I can't go ahead and portray this woman and do her justice unless I actually live this and feel it in my heart. You know, absolutely stunning. That's method acting to the core. She lived that character through all her research. And, you know, I honestly believed her when she said, you know, it's really important for me that I honoured the memory of those people who, many of whom, of course, gave the ultimate sacrifice and died in the most horrendous ways. You know, Hitler had decreed that all captured SOE agents and related individuals would be sent into the Nacht der Nebel, the night and the fog. In other words, you would die in such a way that your relatives, your family, would never even know your fate. That was the idea.
And I know that's something that you've written about in the past is female British agents. I think what comes to mind is the Josephine Baker book, and it's something that I wasn't as much aware of, but now as an adult, you think and you're like, that makes sense because it's such a huge part of counterintelligence. And I really appreciated her performance as well. I thought it was a showstopper and a scene stealer at times for sure. One of the questions I ask everyone when it comes to true story films, I've talked to people who've lived these stories, I've talked to people who are ancestors and then historians as well, like yourself. When it comes to the film, like you said, there's still the essence of truth there. But what sort of rating would you give it in terms of historical accuracy and really presenting what happened in Operation Postmaster? Understood that they're not going to get everything right, and a Hollywood film has to move in a specific way. But how happy were you? You don't have to give a rating, but if you could, out of 10, what would you say?
Okay, so I'll answer that question in a kind of roundabout way by telling you a story. Obviously, I was sent an early copy of the movie, and the thing is, I sat down to watch it at home with my wife and 4 children. So my youngest is 15, and she's a girl, obviously, very proud of her, love her to death. But let's be frank about it. Most 15-year-old girls are not interested in World War II stories. Okay, just a fact, yeah. And then I had 3 other kids there as well. All right, one of them at university, the others at school. Okay, and everybody loved the movie. First and foremost, my 15-year-old daughter. I'll tell you something else, right? The next weekend, we sat down to choose a movie from Netflix or whatever, and she said, let's watch The Imitation Game. The Imitation Game is the movie about Bletchley Park in the Second World War. Wow. Now, that's what the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare catalysed in my family. She'd never read the book, but boy, did she love the movie, and boy, did it get her interested in this field and this era. So, my answer to that is, I do get emails from regular readers saying, I'm appalled at the way they've turned your wonderful factual book into this movie that's not factually accurate. Well, yes, it isn't factually accurate, but it's true to the spirit and essence of those individuals. And most of the scenes, as I've explained, are rendered in a way which I'm really, really pleased with. So, on a score of 1 to 10, I'd say 8 at least. And I tell you another thing about it as well, just to round off. If watching the movie makes just the percentage of the people who see it go away, do some more research, maybe buy the book, read the book, that's a many splendid thing. And especially in this day and age where I think there's a tendency to forget the sacrifices that those people who fought World War II on our behalf made on our behalf for our freedoms and our democracies, which are so under assault and under threat this day. If it can widen awareness, of what people were fighting for, and that we still need to this day to fight for our democratic freedoms, that has to be a good thing.
I agree. I agree. And I can totally see a lot of people really starting to take an interest in this part of history after watching the film. I do ask that people go read your book because I quite enjoyed it, and I think it gives a whole different lens to it, and you get to learn a lot more about the events surrounding it, and many of the other events that might be in future movies as well. Damien, I really appreciate your time. I just wanted to ask a little bit about some of the work you're doing now. If you'd like to tell people about that, where they can find you, things like that, because I know that lots of people will be interested in lots of your other work as well.
Yes, I'm just finishing writing a book about the Special Air Service and their operations in France and Germany, so 1944 and 45. That comes out in October. It's called SAS Daggers Drawn. And you can find me on social media. I'm on Twitter at author D Lewis. I'm on Instagram, same at author D Lewis, and I'm on Facebook at Damien Lewis Writer. And my website's just my name, www.damienlewis.com. I do use it quite a lot. I post updates on what I'm doing and things I think are important. So yeah, do follow me if you're so inclined.
And you also had a book come out quite recently, SAS Great Escapes. I think the third volume, if
Yeah,
that's
that's
correct.
right.
So I do ask people to go look for that as well. It's definitely something that I'll be looking for, and I really appreciate your time. For all the people that do want to watch, the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare will be released on Prime on July 25th here in North America. I'm not sure about the international markets, but I think it'll be a pretty similar rollout as well. And it was quite enjoyable. So, Damien, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and I can't wait to talk to you about hopefully the future films as well.
Great stuff. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much. Take care.